Welcome back to Wages and Employment at Wilfrid Laurier University. In our last video, we built our basic labor supply model. Today, we're going to look at what happens when our potential income constraint changes. For reference, you should pair this video with readings in Chapter 2 of your textbook. Now, we're going to start here with our constrained utility maximization problem. The person is offered a wage rate W1 in the labor market. They have non-labor income YN1, and this person is willing to work H1 hours, with L1 hours of leisure time being part of their optimal choice. Now, suppose the person has a rich uncle or something who starts giving them money every day. We'd all love for that to happen. Now, this is an increase in non-labor income, which we will represent with YN2. That's going to shift up the amount that they can consume if they don't work any hours at all, extending that line up from the time endowment. But it also shifts up the amount that they can consume for any amount of work hours. So it also shifts up the rest of the budget constraint. An important thing to recognize here is that the slope of the budget constraint, also known as the price of leisure, has not changed at all. Instead, we've only gained some income to purchase more of all goods. We have not changed the relative price of leisure and consumption. And it's that relative price that's going to matter later on. Now, as long as these are both normal goods, we will consume more of each of them and end up working less. The new equilibrium is at point B here with our new hours at H2. Overall, an increase in our non-labor income has resulted in a reduction of work hours. What if instead of changing non-labor income, we change the wage rate? This is a bit more challenging. Now, the amount we can consume if we don't work at all hasn't changed with an increase in a wage rate. But the slope of our potential income constraint has changed. And since the new wage rate is higher, our potential income constraint becomes steeper. Can we predict where the new optimal choice for this person would be? Not without knowing more about the individual's utility function. What I'm going to show you in the next few slides is that the overall effect on hours worked is theoretically ambiguous. But first, we have to think back to your microeconomics courses and remember what income and substitution effects of a price change are all about. Now here, we're looking at an increase in the wage rate, and that's going to have two separate effects. First, we have an income effect. Here, a worker has a higher income when we see a wage increase from which they can purchase all goods, including their leisure time. They're wealthier, they're richer than they were before. With that, we're going to see a reduction in their hours worked. The substitution effect is reflecting that relative price of leisure. That relative price of leisure has increased when we see a wage increase, making it relatively more expensive compared to consumption goods. That will reduce how much leisure time a person is going to purchase, and that increases the number of hours they are working. Overall, you can see these effects working in two different directions when it comes to the amount of leisure time people are going to take on. So overall, the effect of a wage increase is theoretically ambiguous. So here, we're going to map this into our diagram. You might have noticed I altered it a bit from our previous diagrams and that the curve is a little bit wonky so that we can fit everything in. But we're starting with wages W1 and finding an optimal bundle at point A, working H1 hours with W1 in place. I always start with the substitution effects. Imagine altering the price of leisure, which here is the slope of the potential income constraint, and finding a point where people are just as well off as before, but facing the new prices. What would they choose? I start by bringing in this dashed line, the slope of which represents the new price level, so that new wage rate W2. And we're going to bring it in line with the indifference curve that goes through our original optimal bundle at point A. I call this my imaginary constraint because I've never invented a better name for it, but it ends up being tangent at point B here. What does this tell us? It's a hypothetical situation. Imagine leisure being made more expensive, but you'd be compensated so that you can make different choices and be made as well off as you were before. You'd find a point where the new wage rate is equal to the marginal rate of substitution given a particular level of utility, and that happens here at point B. Here, because leisure becomes more expensive, you give up some of it and work more hours. This is reflecting our substitution effect. So now we want to figure out what the income effect is, and our starting point is now B on this imaginary budget constraint. The new higher wage rate, W2, is already mapped into the slope there. So we just need to think about the extra income associated with any choice of work hours. Think of this as a parallel shift from that imaginary budget constraint to the new actual budget constraint, represented by the solid purple line here. So then we just have to see what the new optimal choice is, which is marked in as point D here. Overall, we have a reduction in leisure from L1 to L3. So in this case, we would say the substitution effect that drives an increase in hours worked when wages increase dominates the income effect that drives a reduction in hours when wages increase. But that is not necessarily the case. This depends entirely on what an individual's preferences look like. Here, I've drawn in a similar diagram for a different individual, though you might notice I moved some parts to make everything fit. The substitution effect still works to reduce leisure time and increase the number of hours worked. And the income effect still works to increase leisure time and consumption and reduce hours worked. But the overall effect, moving from A to D, is such that the income effect dominates. This was the part driving a reduction in hours worked. And overall, the increase in leisure time from L1 to L3 is a reduction in work hours. So that income effect dominates the substitution effect for this individual. Now, so far we have focused on the case where people were already working and continued to work some positive hours after things changed. In our next video, we're taking a closer look at the extensive margin to see what happens to participation in the labor market when we see wages and non-labor income changing. See you then.